Hi, I'm Ben Mankiewicz. Welcome to TCM and more of our Wednesday night spotlight on disaster movies. The craze for these big-budget, all-star movies about epic catastrophes reached its peak in the 1970s, beginning with Airport, which became a sensational box office hit in 1970. Up next, a movie that came relatively late in the cycle, from producer Walter Mirisch in 1978, Gray Lady Down. Charlton Heston leads a cast of familiar faces playing a U.S. naval submarine captain on his final voyage. He's an experienced captain, so I'm sure his last assignment goes smoothly. He commands the Neptune, a nuclear submarine, but just as he's about to bring it back into port, the sub collides with a Norwegian cargo ship. I guess I was wrong. Submarine begins to sink dangerously below sea level, and much of the film follows the frantic efforts to retrieve it and rescue any of the survivors aboard. By the time he made Gray Lady Down, Charlton Heston had already starred in a handful of other disaster movies, including Airport 1975 and Earthquake, both of those released in 1974. He had also just played a U.S. naval captain in another film produced by Walter Mirisch, the World War II movie Midway from 1976. Along with Heston, the cast here also includes David Carradine, Stacy Keach, Ned Beatty, and Ronnie Cox. This was 6 years after Beatty and Cox co-starred quite memorably in Deliverance. Keep an eye out as well for two young actors making their film debuts. Michael O'Keefe plays a young officer. This was his first movie role. He immediately followed it with an Oscar-nominated performance as Robert Duvall's son in The Great Santini. He also memorably played Danny in Caddyshack. This was also the first film for an actor who skyrocketed to fame, in a manner of speaking, later the same year, Christopher Reeve. Reeve appeared in two movies released in 1978. The first, the one we're about to see. The second, of course, was Superman. From 1978, directed by David Green, Charlton Heston leads the way in Gray Lady Down. In his memoir, Charlton Heston wrote that in his research for Gray Lady Down, he, quote, found that submariners alone among U.S. Navy personnel are allowed to wear beards. Since I had the time, I proposed to the director that I grow one. According to Heston, the director David Green replied, "You're a superstar. You can do whatever you want." Green, however, had only made a handful of feature films, including the 1973 adaptation of the musical Godspell. He worked more consistently in television and directed the first episode of the landmark series Roots, which premiered a year before Gray Lady Down. Earlier in his career, back in 1956, David Green was also the director of a teleplay broadcast on Canadian TV called Flight into Danger. The script was written by Arthur Haley, who went on to write the best-selling novel Airport, adapted as the hit 1970 disaster movie. Flight into Danger, the Canadian teleplay, also made its way to the big screen as the 1957 aviation disaster movie 0 Hour, starring Dana Andrews, which we showed here on TCM last week. 0 Hour, a pretty heavy drama, was interpreted quite differently by brothers David and Jerry Zucker, along with Jim Abrams. The three of them reimagined 0 Hour 23 years later in 1980, and turned it into what may be the defining comedy of its time, Airplane. Coming up, another disaster at sea, but this one really happened. A Night to Remember from 1958. The story of the sinking of the Titanic is next on TCM.
Next on TCM, A Night to Remember, then The Last Voyage, and later, Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. Sink or swim with TCM tonight.